our title. Okay, logistics, a introduction really to logistics for the main Continental Army. Next slide. Okay. Anyone aware of who Elihu Root was? Our Secretary of War at the turn of this past century. And he said, no, logistics really has only been formally around as a field since the Korean War. Although all these activities were being performed, there was no real special name other than supply for what was happening out there to keep the armies out in the field and moving. So I don't think I have a need to read the slide. You can read that on your own unless someone out there would like it to be read. Next. Okay. It helps to have a setting for when you're going to discuss a topic. And I have chosen an encampment by Washington that occurred from the 10th of August to 23rd of August in 1777. This is really the beginning of the Philadelphia campaign, because from this location, they will finally identify where the British are going to, that fleet that left New York City, or actually left the Jersey coast after marching down to try and attack Washington and New Jersey Piedmont. This is, this is where they went to stay, and then they left from this point to march down directly to Brandywine. So that's at the very beginning of the campaign. Next slide, please. Back to logistics, next slide. Okay, though it's a modern term, I thought we should use some of the definitions to help us get a handle on what we mean when we're talking about military logistics. And to support the soldier in the field with what's needed, when, where, and in the condition and quantity required at minimal expense of resources. And just a quick point here, down below low in a lot of the slides, I will list the source. At the last slide for this presentation will give my email address if one would like a copy of the annotated bibliography that I've had pulled together for this particular talk. So you don't need to try and scroll down sources quickly during the presentation. Next slide. Okay, a map of where we're at. Okay, the Mullen House is up at the top. Currently, it's located between Old York Road and York Road above Bristol Road in Bucks County. Washington selected this site because Old York Road was a major route through to New York City, as was the Kings Highway on the Jersey side of the Delaware River. Washington was well aware of the site. He liked the house. He knew several members of the family. Okay, so next question. Oh, actually, you should see from this slide and probably some other slides which indicate the vast road network that we have here. We have a good number of parallel roads running west to east and from the northwest down to the southeast. And you generally do not want to have your entire line of movement or line of march being boxed up behind one another. Washington alone had 20 wagons in his entourage for his stuff. So you can imagine what would have happened if you did not have several routes to get from point A to point B, which is a logistical concern. Next slide. Okay, this is maybe a little bit more harder to see, but essentially we have the Delaware River, and in addition to having a network of roads, they're attached to many different points that you can cross over into New Jersey. Once again, bottlenecks are at river crossings. So this is very fortuitous for the location, and one of the reasons Washington located this particular site, as I said, they didn't know where the British fleet was heading. The word was that it was heading down towards this. They saw it was going to go into Philadelphia, didn't go into Delaware Bay. And the next time they had word where it was down at Satuxet River, which is roughly where Ocean City, Maryland is presently located. So Washington and his aides, staff, thought that the British were heading for Charleston. Then a little bit later report came that they were heading up the East Chesapeake Bay. So, okay, little burp there. They're heading up East Chesapeake Bay. So Washington then decided they're going to go meet the British coming from that direction, which is when they broke camp at the Mullen House, and then headed across those crossing points of the Schuylkill River. They head for Brandywine. We know what happened at Brandywine. Next slide, please. Okay. This shows the various crossing points across the Schuylkill River at that particular point in time. This is a contemporary map of what is down there. It also shows many of the escape routes used out of Brandywine. Next slide, please. Our topic, the main Continental Army. At this point in time, there were 5 divisions in the main Continental Army, which was the Continental Army for the 1st Department. We had 4 departments in which there were could be armies. There wasn't much really down in the 4th Department, which was the South, because that was essentially a internal partisan war that was going on between loyalists and those who wanted to rebel. On this particular chart, well, as I said, there was 4 divisions. There was a 5th division, which contained Morgan's riflemen over in New Jersey, waiting to be dispatched up through to the battle at Saratoga, where they had a significant influence. The only things really of some of the positions of the higher level persons that are here in charge of different departments are in the upper 2 sides. And in green are listed the persons that were formerly their aides of the camp of Washington. I found it interesting that all of his entire set of cavalry units is headed by a former aide de camp. Next slide, please. Okay. What was the size of the army that was here that needed to be taken care of? This is looking at all those various units, 4 divisions that were to be here, and using the set figures for how many persons occupied the different ranks in the different divisions and different regiments, is able to come up with a rough figure of 7,500 to 8,000 as being comprising the main Continental Army at this point in time. Now, the accounts for this particular encampment, though, have 13,000 people there. So I will endeavor quickly to explain where all those additional people came from. Next slide, please. If someone has a question along the way, are the persons able to speak up or ask questions? I take that as a no. Okay, Congress was faced with a dilemma. The dilemma was, how does a representative government deal with organizing the military structure for the company, for the country? And what they decided to do was to have a board of war and ordnance headed or staffed with 5 current congressional members, plus a paid secretary and clerks. John Adams was the first president of this particular group. The duties were basically what we would expect: raise, equip, dispatch the troops, accounting for arms, ammunition, equipment, etc. Now, shortly after this particular encampment in autumn of 1777, it was determined that congressional members were consuming too much time dealing with these activities that they couldn't attend to their regular duties. So they decided to set up a separate board of non-congressional members to handle the board of war function. Next slide. There were 5 supply systems that were established. There are 5 departments to support the Army: Quartermaster, the Commissary or Commissariat, the Clothing Department, the Ordnance Department, and the Hospital Department. Information is generally available on the first 2 and the last one, but it's not as much information is available about number 3 and number 4. Next question, or next slide. The starting point would be this, what was the standard daily food ration? This is one of the main supplies that's needed besides ammunition, tendage, etc. And initially this was set by the individual states, and then it was decided, okay, that they would redefine what this, the board actually would redefine what was ordered. If you go down the list, you'll see several different places where if something is not available, they would pay the grand sum of 1/72 of a dollar, which I presume was to be used to try and buy a replacement item for that particular item. And most likely that was a alcoholic beverage. Down at the bottom also, part of this daily food ration was providing candles for the men so they could see things at night. A lot of salt, presumably for the salting the meat and being able to keep that preserved. And a supply of hard soap, 8 pounds per 100 men. This was the ideal list of what was being sought to be supplied. Next slide. The Commissary Department. We have 3 basic functions for the Commissary Department. You have to buy the supplies, you need to store the supplies, and you need to issue the supplies out of the storage magazines. For the location where the supplies were stored in this general area was around the new county seat in Newtown, Pennsylvania, along the one road that runs along the upper part of the town, which also coincidentally Washington was familiar with because he had his headquarters at a gas station location now, which is there. And this will be the fairly general structure which is used for all the departments. You have a general of that particular function, then you have deputy commissioners and assistant commissioners assigned for them. Benjamin Flowers or Philhauer, I believe I heard someone at a previous meeting say the name was a contraction of, is listed there. Next slide. Okay, the first Quartermaster General was Thomas Mifflin. Generally, he's given, I would say, some poor marks for his service. But given that this was the first time this was being attempted on such a scale within the colonies, I think that's rather unfair. He served, grew frustrated, and tried to resign. They called him back in again. And his replacement was one Nathaniel Greene, who served in the post until he finally received a commission to lead an army down south. And the lessons that he learned from dealing with the quartermaster post, he took to great heart and used very extremely effectively during that Southern campaign. That in itself is a whole story. Next slide, please. Quartermaster Department, as I said, we had Mifflin, and the other names I will not take all the time to go reading through them, but you can just see all the different slots that you go through. Next slide. Transportation. How do you get the gear associated with the soldiers from point to point without them carrying it all on their back? Well, there was a wagon assigned initially for every 6 soldiers to haul the tent, cooking gear, and their sleep gear, as well as any supplies they're currently carrying. Each wagon required a teamster to drive it. Officers were allocated an additional wagon based upon their rank. Washington had 20 such wagons. But then one of the items he was hauling was those 2 gigantic tents that were used during this encampment, as well as when he was in other locations. Another transport problem or situation, you had your food supply could be moved on a hoof. Primarily you had beef cattle. And so this was an assignment that was rotated between the different divisions. At this time, Anthony Wayne's division was charged with keeping the cattle moving. I presume that this probably was the group that trailed the overall wagon, as I would not have wanted to travel behind a herd of cattle with its droppings. Next slide. Oh, first of all, am I proceeding too fast or a reasonable pace? Can I see any thumbs up or down on the picture? Duties when establishing a camp. This is culled from Washington's actual correspondence. The quartermaster for that particular army would establish where the headquarters was going to be, and then notify the adjutant general of that location, the general staff officers, and the postmaster. The reason for this is that although Washington was in the Mullen House, which we'll see a picture of, across the street is where they had the postmaster, they had a bulletin board, and they had the whipping post for those who had grievous offenses while in camp. The quartermaster general basically told the division quartermasters where they were. The division quartermasters assigned the locations for their individual brigades, and the brigade quartermaster handled the regiments. Gives you the chain of order that was established. And an important point, one of the important points for logistics was concerned with the hygiene. And these are two particular provisions which first came out at this particular encampment. And they're ordered to redig the latrines every, or what they called vaults, every other day. They're here for 10 days. So I can imagine the number of holes that were scattered all over camp that had to be carefully avoided. In addition, in order not to offend the ladies that might be in a neighborhood, the men were ordered to cut down trees and to properly position them so that the soldiers could not be seen relieving themselves in the latrines. And finally, once again, for hygiene factors, offal is the residual remains from slaughtered animals or cattle. And you can't simply leave that lying around in the open, especially if you're going to be there for several days in August, because the flies will be tremendous. So they had to bury that on a daily basis. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, you may think this encampment with the numbers I gave between 8,500 and 1,300 would be not really significant. But if you look in the middle of this chart, the small little blue dot is the roughly 120 inhabitants of the Warwick Township at the before there was an encampment. The green bar behind it represents the 8,500 persons that were with the Continental Army, and the blue bar is if the Army had been fully filled and had its ranks at 100%, it would have been more than double that size. So there obviously was problems in trying to keep sufficient quantity of men in the Continental Army. Whereas if you look at the first set of bars, this is the Philadelphia being occupied by the British. The Philadelphia population is the dark blue bar in the front. With the British Army added, you get the green bar. And if the British Army had themselves been fully staffed, they'd be the light blue bar in the back. So obviously we had greater problems trying to keep sufficient troops in the field than the British did. Next slide. Okay, this is getting at the discrepancy between 7,500 to 8,500 versus 13,000 people. The middle box is the Army itself in the various levels. These figures I drew to be roughly proportional to the actual numbers that fell in the various categories, to give you a sense for how many men were in each of these different levels and performing these other jobs. Now, to the left, we have attached individuals. These are primarily the spouse, the soldiers. Yeah. How could you, as a Continental soldier, leave your wife and family behind and having to fend for themselves if you didn't have sufficient family in the area? So there was a considerable number of wives and children accompanying the Continental Army. This group also included a number of fathers and mothers of different soldiers. If we go up to the top quarter on the left-hand side. These are persons that are attached either to, or they're either attached to officers already with Washington, or they're persons that are trying to seek various positions, mostly in the officer corps, not being volunteer soldiers. Moving over to the right-hand side of the screen, we have the mercantile community. These, not all supplies were coming from the Army itself. Wherever the Army stopped, an instant local marketplace came into existence. So you had a good proportion of supplies coming from the local populace. You then had persons that had been contracted to haul supplies and bring it to the Army. And then a final little group were the sutlers who sold good. Was a sutler that was assigned to each one of the regiments, and they sold goods that were of use to the soldiers. Quite often that was an alcoholic beverage. Sutlers too often were the wife of an officer that headed a regiment. A little bit of too much nepotism in that particular case. And then down in the lower quarter, we have basically what we're looking at in the logistical structure. The contract spot market services, which are going on, local forage and food and bringing in food, and all those departments that have started covering for the Continental Army are in that particular group. Am I proceeding too quickly or at a good pace?
I think you're doing good.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. All right. All those civilians were considered to be persons serving with the Army. That we had mentioned, the civilian employees rather, and they were in the public service and to be maintained at public expense. So in addition to the Army, all this support apparatus had to be supplied and have their tonnage and have their gear hauled around. Next slide, please. This is a list of various positions that would fall into that particular category. I particularly note the second one, which is clerks. Maintaining the rosters and keeping track of everything that's going on require a considerable number of clerks. Then we have the storekeepers, supplies, wagon masters, and wagoneers, who are a major problem. I think the list is self-explanatory. Next slide, please. Everyone's had a chance to read it. Just a quick thing on hospital care. At this point in time in the colonies, I'm only aware that there were two general hospitals in cities, Philadelphia and New York City. So hospital care was not something that would happen for any sort of extended care, very intensive care. A patient would be housed in a room at the actual doctor's house. So that was what sufficed for hospital care. Another point I'd like to make is about the Washington pushed heavily for vaccinating the troops for smallpox, primarily because while on a trip as a youth to Barbados, he had contracted smallpox, and his face was indeed scarred, had some smallpox scars on it. So this was a concern wherever you have a large number of persons with troops, and you want to keep this definitely under control. So we have a definite health logistical action being taken here. Okay. And then they started developing the flying hospital came into existence. Then after Brandywine, you had a hospital going into Yellow Springs, Pennsylvania, which is on the southern slope of the Appalachian Valley. And later on, you had an additional camp being constructed at Basking Ridge. Temporarily, the provision was ordered that you would have 2 to 3 tents available, I believe, per regiment, in order to take care of the men that were sick and could not be sent elsewhere. Next slide, please. And here's the hospital department. You'll notice there was no hospital department for the 4th Department, which is the Southern Department. I presume that this was mostly because you had partisan warfare going on down in the South. And then we had the same structure existing for each of the Northern departments, which basically was the Middle Department, the 1st Department being Pennsylvania and New Jersey. You then, I believe, had, I'm not certain where New York would fill into, but definitely New England was a separate department. Next slide, please. This is a reproduction of the hospital that was at Valley Forge. I put this in because it was extraordinary the amount of effort they put into designing such a simple little structure. They were well aware of the different diseases at different rates of infections. So they tried to, and also that somehow breathing and ventilation affected or impacted the general health. So they laid out any of these such buildings, or even several floors in a multiple story building, such that you kept the different diseases and injuries apart in different locations, which best suited those individual soldiers. I found this as a rather modern concept, for so long ago, and when there were very few hospitals around to begin with. Next slide, please. Okay. We already covered about the vaults to be redug every day. Another item which was mentioned in Washington's postings to the troops as general orders was to have the officers administer saltpeter to the soldiers. This, I presume, was to try and keep a curb on any sexual appetites and impulses. And just a note at the bottom, women were available. Their services could be purchased for doing such things as mending clothes and cooking, or for getting a share of food. Actually, I would presume that they cooked for the soldiers. And my final little note at the bottom, Washington had his own personal staff of 5 individuals caring for him. Billy Lee was one of those individuals, but the others were a housekeeper and cooks. And Washington, several of these persons would take care of Lafayette when he was wounded, and those 2 persons, Lafayette purchased their home down in Philadelphia following the American Revolution to try and compensate them for the care that they had given to him at this particular point in time. Next slide, please. Okay, supply department really could not find too much information on how it was formally organized, but basically there had been a system in the past for going out and making purchases during the French and Indian War, but that one was successful because you had a British gold that was being used to pay for obtaining those particular items. Now we have Continental dollars, which the expression was not worth a Continental. So money really was not considered a good commodity received by the general populace. Okay. And the need for supplies was determined at the Continental Army level, but provision of supplies was to come from the individual states from which the units came. Okay, the next slide, please. I want to point out logistical support received from the Continental militia. Since we have a preponderance of persons from New Jersey, if you skip probably down to, I believe it is the bottom, a lot of food was being supplied by the New Jersey militia. They actually went into Hunterdon, out into the Hunterdon County, out into the fields to do some harvesting to provide rations for their troops, while at Valley Forge, and also getting supplies from any other place they could, loyalist houses, I presume. And looking at the Chamonix encampment overall, we had the militia take over from Matt Anthony Wayne's division guarding the cattle once they got across the Schuylkill River. There was, I believe, 400 head of cattle with them. And they drove these cattle towards Brandywine, where in addition to guarding the cattle, they were available as a tripwire between where the Continental Army was and the Brandywine Creek down below them. Okay. And one of the other main duties comes after the British have occupied Philadelphia, and the Bucks County militia in particular, and other militia units were called in from around the state. Some of them came from as far as north of Harrisburg in order to perform military duties supporting the Continental Army. And their key duty was to suppress food supplies from getting into the British. Okay, and the next to last item I have at the bottom of this, there was the British must have been impacted by these particular actions of having the militia involved in trying to cut off food supplies into Philadelphia, because they sent a light infantry unit and horsemen out to attack a camp of Pennsylvania militia from Bucks County that were patrolling back and forth along the roads doing this interception. And they caught up with them just outside of Hatboro, a place they refer to as Crooked Billet, where high school is located. Okay. And Lacey leads. Okay, we covered that. So the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, some more logistical concerns that came up. These are reasonable when you consider that this encampment's in mid-August. Don't go galloping the horses back and forth over the ground. Don't wear them out. Similarly, don't drill the men till they collapse in the hot sun. And the final item is they must have been short on oil to be greasing their guns, because they had a definite order was cut to use offal or the waste from the cattle to grease up the guns. Next slide, please.
Another round table.
Financing. Okay. Major difficulty. There was no central banking system for the colonies. You're lucky if you had 2 or 3 banks that were affiliated. Usually they were each operating independently. So you could not readily transfer funds and go back and forth between the banking institutions. We were primarily a specie-based economy and not, rather than paper dollars. They're not worth a Continental. So we had Spanish coinage. The Spanish ambassador from St. Louis on the Mississippi sent to the Continental Army $30,000 in gold to help, the cause. Many are probably not aware of such Spanish support for us. Okay. And another key point that should be mentioned is Robert Morris himself. Morris is said to have had the ability to instantly know what markets to go to in terms of any type of coinage or specie or gold or silver. Who was paying the most, who was giving you the least for it, and using those gaps to his advantage to acquire goods. Similarly, this went with dealing with the actual commodities themselves. He had a sense for what it cost in different areas, where he could get the best portion, best quantities for the least money. So his was a major contribution with these particular abilities. Next slide, please. In terms of specifics within the Articles of Confederation, basically, from what I can see, these are the only 2 mentions of anything dealing with logistics and it's dealing with the charges and responsibility for the debts of the war. And Congress simply said, yeah, we'll take responsibility for them, even though they knew they were going to have difficulties paying it. Presumption being that we'd be able to get the money from some foreign power, France or Spain, to help pay for those things. Indeed, France was certainly providing a lot. Next slide, please. Okay, now this slide should have been cut out of the presentation. It's simply just giving an idea of the amount of food that would have been required to feed an army. I had solid figures from the Civil War, which points out how many horses and mules, how much they ate, and how much were needed for the men. So the amounts that were being supplied to the army, even though they may have been meager, they were not inconsequential in their volume and the difficulty in raising these supplies. Just a point to make us aware of the efforts that had to be undergone. Next slide, please. Finally, you should have a good general understanding of the general logistical operations for the main Continental Army in August of 1777. And if anyone would like to dig deeper into this particular topic, I have a 24-page annotated bibliography that I could send to you via email if you use the email address, which is at the bottom of this slide. This concludes a brief introduction to logistical efforts of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. I don't recall covering any of this stuff in any of my history classes. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ed. That was great. Looks like
We have a couple comments in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
So Mary Jane Meckling mentions that the cook that you talked about earlier was a lady named Hannah Till.
Yes, that is correct. Hannah and her husband.
Right. And John Fabiano mentions the massacre at Crooked Billet, where the British, probably the loyalists who were
No, this was a light infantry movement with cavalry that was sent up out of Philadelphia.
they also
attack
were,
it.
yeah, they were accompanied by the Queen's Rangers, who
Yes.
were loyalists, and they apparently got the blame for throwing the wounded soldiers onto, I think it was buckwheat straw, and burning them.
And burning it. Yes, that was and this covered a fairly broad area. This stretched towards Hatboro. The running battle did not end until they got to Bristol Road. And they were pursued by the British across a fairly broad area. It was nasty.
So what comments or questions do we have from the audience?
I just have a little comment. When you brought up the Board of War and its change, I just finished a paper that I submitted to the JAR on Thaddeus Kosciuszko, engineer at West Point. And it's interesting that his godfather, Horatio Gates, in November of 1777 was named president of the reconstituted Board of War. And he was the one who sent Kosciuszko up to West Point. The interesting thing is he was the president of the Board of War during the Conway cabal. And when he ended up resigning and asked for an active appointment, and he was reappointed in April to be the commander of the Northern Theater. So Horatio Gates was the first president of the Board of War when they stopped being all congressmen and they turned to the military.
Thank you for that additional information.
Oh, Joe, I might add to that Mark Lender's recent book about the Conway Cabal carries that issue exclusively, and about how serious the threat was to Washington's authority, and how Washington politically was adept at countering that attack. The other thing I wanted to mention was the fascinating way that Nathaniel Greene took over the Quartermaster department. Everyone I believe everyone knows that he was very reluctant to do that, questioning what kind of honors does a quartermaster receive. But
3% 3% commission for the the sale purchases.
I did my master's thesis at Rutgers Camden on Nathaniel Greene, and it was public honor versus private interest, and the way that they did take full advantage of that. Not only him, but what was very interesting, and it relates back to my talk on Joseph Reed, was folks that had seen that would have heard that it seems like Joseph Reed orchestrated this because he was related to both of the deputies that seemed to run, that were his sidemen. John Cox was his uncle by marriage to Reed, and of course Pettit was his brother-in-law, married his half sister. So and his father's former business partner. So Reed was orchestrated that, I believe, masterfully, and he knew what the dire straits that were occurring at that time, because he was part of the Congressional committee that was sent to review the troops and the situation there. So and he was Lender makes the claim that it was Reed's efforts in the Congress that actually prevented Gates from taking the upper hand in that affair.
Oh. Hey,
Okay.
Ed Greenawald, I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the 3% that you mentioned. I didn't quite catch all that.
I believe it was 1%. I've exaggerated it to 2. And then when I was questioned on it, I went back to research, and I believe it was only 1%. It was 1% of everything that went through the quartermaster's department. So can you imagine?
That is actually what was received by Green. He shared the other percentages with the persons that were working for him.
Oh, and it was supposed to be strictly Cox and Pettit. The 3 of them were the ones that
Each got a share.
the commission. And that's why I see Joe Reed's hand all over this, because he was taking care of somebody who had become dependent upon him, meaning Pettit, and he followed. Pettit followed Reed's career anyway as a deputy of the state of New Jersey and all those other things. But it was just interesting the way that was orchestrated.
Yeah, they find all these little threads, which definitely make things interesting when you look at the American Revolution. The other point regarding Nathaniel Green is how he had set up a series of magazines or warehouses, which facilitated the movement of troops heading over towards in New Jersey. He also established one from up further in Pennsylvania going on down. So these were warehouses that could be drawn upon and bring supplies, especially when you're on the move. He used this particular concept also throughout his Southern campaign. He commandeered a great number of rivercraft and moved them to appropriate locations when he needed them, as well as certain supplies. So though he didn't want the tenure as Quartermaster General, it served him in good stead in how he conducted his campaign down south. A topic, I think, in its own right.
Ed, do you know who the commissary or quartermaster generals were after Green? Or anyone,
anyone that comes to mind of any particular? No, I did not.
I'm thinking Connecticut, maybe Wadsworth or somebody similar to Wadsworth.
We always talk about Mifflin and Green, and then we forget the war kept going on.
Yeah, the war kept going on, and we lose sight. And I don't even have sight of those individuals in looking at things. They're not part of the common or body of knowledge which is out there.
Interesting. Some other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. Because of all the animals, horses and mules and then wagons, and were there a number of blacksmith groups?
That was part of that support group that I had covered before. Persons that were being contracted locally, they also probably had several that traveled with them, because they couldn't always depend upon being able to find a local set of blacksmiths to handle the massive needs that they had.
Mm-hmm.
So each cavalry troop had its own farrier to take care of at least some of those issues. Shoeing horses and such. And each regiment was composed of, I can't remember now, maybe 8 troops or so. Somebody who knows more can correct that. But each one has if you look at the rosters, each one has a farrier listed
To handle those shoeing duties.
6 troops.
Is your presentation, I forgot, is it available in the PDF? Is it on file there, or can we get that with the maps? I'm particularly interested because I'm in Newtown, and I'm interested in the places around here that would have been used for storage, etc.
They just mentioned Newtown, and Newtown was the new county seat for Bucks County at that point in time. Also, Washington, as I had mentioned, had briefly had his headquarters just in the outskirts up there.
Yeah, I'm only a few blocks from that, from his post there, and then the brick house where other offices were stationed.
So if it's okay with Ed, I can share his presentation with you if you'll send me your email address.
Sure.
Ed?
It's a lot of bytes.
All right. I see that Kevin Donahue joined us. Hey, Kevin.
Yeah, sorry, I was helping move some furniture today, so my apologies. I really wanted to be here on time.
Well, we recorded it, so you will be able to look at it on YouTube maybe in a week or so.
That's great. And I don't know who covered for Green. I think he eventually left. I think it was even 1780 when he stopped being quartermaster. I would have guessed maybe Sullivan, but I'm just not sure.
There's a comment in the chat room about Pickering took over.
Okay.
That's a likely candidate from Pickering was out from the Chester, Pennsylvania area.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really sorry I wasn't here earlier because oftentimes the commentary of the guest is very rewarding as well. And thank you for the presentation.
Yeah. How
One
about
last question, if you can. Do you feel Washington broke camp because he ran out of local supplies, or he voluntarily said this is the time to meet the British?
Okay, well, to give you the internet, the camp was being held. They knew the British were heading down the coast, and he was responding to the limited information that was coming in piecemeal as to where the fleet was located. They initially thought he was going to attack Philadelphia. No, not the case. Then they thought he was heading down to Charleston, South Carolina. That was not the case. Then it was a report that they were up the halfway up the bay in the Chesapeake, and that's when they determined that Philadelphia was the target, but they were coming in through the back door, not up the Delaware River.
So Washington didn't
good.
deplete the area. He could have gone at any time, earlier or sooner, later.
Well,
No,
he,
this
no.
was an ongoing debate as to where were the British, what were their plans. This was a constant point of concern for the officers in Washington and that as to just what were the British up to. And as I said, it wasn't until they were confirmed to be halfway up the eastern portion of Chesapeake Bay that they said, yeah, he's definitely coming in to land down there and heading for Philadelphia.
okay, Ed, we had at the Mullen House, and correct me if we're wrong because we're still all learning. We were told that that's why Washington had his Council of War, because they had no idea where the British would be, and he brings all of his troops together. And we heard that Hamilton was taking the minutes of that Council of War down to Philadelphia, the Congress, when he met the writer who came and said that Howe's troops had been spotted down coming up the Delaware Bay.
Yeah, I
Coming up
wasn't
the
aware that it was
Chesapeake,
Hamilton,
Chesapeake.
but that generally describes the situation.
Okay, so we're correct when we tell people
Yes.
that. Okay, good.
But even Washington complained about all the marching and counter marching. And for as much of the intelligence failure at Brandywine, there was, I think that was like an epic ride that those riders took from I think it was around Little Lake
God.
Harbor and stuff.
Yes, they come charging across from up here to down there.
Hey,
We're in an unknown situation. You just knew there was a large number of British that were coming at you.
Do we
Right,
also
I think-
know, do we also know why Howe came up the Chesapeake and not the Delaware? I know there was Fort Mifflin, but
Well, Turkey
it's-
Point was a well-established disembarkation point, I think, too.
in the Chesapeake?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
No, well, coming up, you would have problems landing along the coast up there because you had three different forts that were constructed along the Delaware River. You also had the row galleys that were around which simply were rowboats with a bow and a nice pointed front, and each had three 3-pound cannon that could be fired from locks that they gun locks that they had on the side of the rowboat. So there was that would have been a concern. And given the porous nature of information flowing around, they would have probably been aware of that. So yeah, it made sense. They wanted to get down and get down safely, get their group organized, and then attack, instead of trying to do a landing assault, which would have caused major problems. The whole area around the Philadelphia airport on over down towards Chester was basically formed by the Dutchmen that had settled this country, building their dikes and reclaiming marshland from a heavily streamed territory. So that whole region up there on the Pennsylvania side was unsuited for landing purposes. And as I said, the New Jersey side, you had not one, but you had 2 forts that had been constructed. And in addition to that, there's a battery on either side of the river for defenses. So your ships could really only come in more along, they were sitting targets as they came in. They had 20-pound and 12-pound guns, cannon, that were stationed at points along the river. So it would have been hazardous, and I'm certain that they had knowledge about it.
And I think terrain was the biggest factor that you pointed out there, Mr. Ed. I mean, Newport, Delaware was like a swamp in that time.
Well, that whole area around the airports was reclaimed due to the Dutch building dikes. That's how it became land. So, and it really wasn't all that well at that time. If you read accounts of the efforts the British had to go through in attacking Fort Mifflin.
Oh, yeah, we've read those with Ewald getting hammered.
Yeah, they did extensive amount of digging and trying to fill in and create firm ground in order to move any cannon into position. So that was a significant British assault, but it took a lot of effort.
If I can just throw in another thing for my boy Tadeusz. When he first came from Poland in August of '76, the Pennsylvania under Ben Franklin, they hired him to redo the forts that French engineers did. So he redid Fort Mifflin and the 2 forts on the Jersey side. One was Red Bank, and the one below it, I forget the name. And they put those cheval de frise, the logs with the points in the channels. So the British
Yes,
spies, and they knew what this, and as Ed was saying, they located, I think, on the Jersey side, at least 16 to 18 cannons that at that bottleneck would have really put a hamper.
and they were heavy cannon. They were not your 3-pounders. They were heavy ones, 18-pounders and higher.
Yeah.
Joe, who was that fellow you mentioned? It was the engineer that rebuilt the fort?
Tadeusz Kościuszko.
Oh, okay.
Well, Thaddeus Kościuszko.
I didn't catch it the first time, and I misspoke. I was referencing Red Bank when I talked about
Yeah.
when I
Mifflin
meant to
was-
say Von Dunnup.
Yeah, and like I said, I forget the name of the fort just below Red Bank.
It's with a B and it slips my mind.
Yeah.
Billingsport. Billingsport.
Billingsport, that's it, yeah.
Billings, yeah.
Hey, a comment for you about the Quartermaster Department, since people asked. I dug out a book that says that the Quartermaster Department was reorganized in July of 1780 by the Board of War, and Greene resigned at that point. Pickering took over, and Pettit really ran it for him. And even though Pickering later tried to resign, he apparently ended up in charge of it till 1785, when by which time he was able to resolve all the accounts and everything. There was quite a bit of worked
Okay.
after the actual revolution was over to just reconcile accounts and things like that. There was a good article recently in the Journal of the American Revolution about one aspect of that, and that was about the captured guns at Yorktown and the disposition of the artillery, which was done at the Head of Elk. That seemed to be like their marshalling yard for artillery. They sold a bunch of it off, some of it obviously to merchant ships so that they could guard the ships. Because back then they had to take care of these things themselves. There was no real Coast Guard. At any rate, interesting article in the JAR about the guns. I think it was Joseph Lee Boyle who wrote it just about 2 months ago. We do have a full schedule for 2022. The second meeting in May, I believe it is, will be about the Alamo of the Revolution, Fort Griswold. And that's Jerry Hurwitz who's going to be talking to us, formerly the head of the Princeton Battlefield Society. Then in September, I believe it is, Bruce Gill, who's the curator of the Charles Thompson's home, Harriton, in out near Haverford, is going to talk to us. And you should remember Charles Thompson as the Secretary to Congress, a very important and influential person. And then in December, Joe Robleski is going to talk with us about the Second Trenton, Battle of Second Trenton.